Okay, so we've talked about various letters in the New Testament, including a brief discussion about how we read, how we can become aware of our tendencies to either read prescriptively or descriptively. And so it's time to kind of look at the overall structure of letters in the ancient world. So let's pull up our PowerPoint for this and consider some structural sort of items. So an ancient letter pretty much had a particular layout. Not always, right? The letters in the New Testament do not always follow a particular structure. Some, like the letter to the Galatians, kind of skip a particular greeting format. But typically speaking, you can discern a greeting, the main part of the letter, and then some form of farewell. And for the greeting, you would find the names of the senders included. Typically, it's multiple ones. An indication of who the recipients are, well wishes, saying that they're praying for them, something about, I've heard recently from you. And then in the main section, that's where the argument is made, the reason for sending this letter. Specific local issues are mentioned. If this is a follow-up letter in correspondence, maybe references made to a prior letter, ethical issues are brought up, maybe a conflict between two people or two groups. And then in the farewell, we see greetings. This can be very lengthy, sometimes very personalized, and sometimes there is a signature by the author himself or herself, in the case of the New Testament, himself. And sometimes there's mention made of who helped, assisted with the actual writing, an amanuensis or something. So looking at a well-known letter in the Bible, the letter to the Romans, as an example here for a moment. So Romans is an undisputed letter, so that means that all scholars believe that Paul, the Apostle Paul, wrote this to the Christians in Rome. This would have been during the winter of 57 and 58. Most people think that Paul was awaiting better weather circumstances to get aboard a ship in Corinth. During this time, Nero was the emperor. So he's writing this to Christians in Rome who are increasingly having more trouble with Nero. This is not yet when we have the fire in Rome, but he's already just causing a lot of trouble. The main theme and main verse for this letter, we find it in the opening chapter. Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, and he quotes the Hebrew Bible. The just shall live by faith. And so the theme here is the universal gospel. The gospel is available for everyone who wants to participate in it, okay? And by saying for the Jew first, it's like when you follow the development of the narrative, it first comes to the Jewish community, and then later on it engages also the Hellenistic world. So that's the kind of like the theme, it sets the pace. You see here a verse from chapter 3, because the first two verses of this book, this letter, kind of sets up the framework. Apparently there are two groups there, which you would say the regular audience, because Rome is predominantly non-Jewish, Gentile. So it sets up this Gentile audience and then a small group of Jews. In the first chapter, Paul pretty much says, you Gentiles, you're really missing out on what God has for you. And then in chapter 2, he also says, no, you Jewish people, you're also missing out. You're all just in big trouble. And then he says, so since you're all equally in trouble, let's look for an equal solution. And so he says, there's a turning point here, but now. In Greek, it says, nunede, but now the righteousness of God, apart from the law, is revealed, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. So that sounds like a lot of Bible glue. But what he's saying here is that God's goodness, the way that God is good, that God is right, can be observed outside of just looking at it the Jewish way. Okay? And it's still something that you have to have two witnesses to see. This is a cultural sort of thing. He says, but this is what brings us together. It shouldn't separate us. Okay. Now, what could have possibly separated two groups in Rome? Well, remember in 49, Claudius issued an edict that everybody should leave the world of Rome. Remember the city? Now, I'm not sure if everybody left, but we do find in 1 Corinthians, we actually find Priscilla and Aquila, two people in the Christian world, in the Christian leadership world, who actually ended up there. And it says it's because of the edict of Claudius. So in early church leadership, eventually the Jewish leaders who started the church had to leave. So the Gentile leaders, the non-Jewish people, kind of kept the ship afloat. And then when the next emperor comes to power, Nero, who of course placated people, he undoes that edict. Everybody can come back. So it means for years, the non-Jewish people kept everything going. Then the Jewish people, a lot of them returned to town, returned to the church and say, we're back. We got the preaching again. We can take care of all the leadership stuff. And the other people say, that's really nice that you're back. Welcome. But we did just fine without you. So you can just kind of take second place. Well, that became conflict. And so the point here is, to try and bring these two parties in this unity back together. And so Paul reminds them, without Jesus, you really have nothing but now. And so when you follow a letter, when you get to the main part, follow the flow. Read it through once in its entirety and see what the main point is. So here's transition. There's a lot of talking about God, a lot of talking about what God's mission is all about. And he brings these people together, deals with very practical local matters, and says, listen, we're all in the same doo-doo here. We all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Then all the way to at the end of the letter, and this is a long letter, he says, therefore I appeal to y'all, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, that y'all, this is all plural, that y'all present your bodies a living sacrifice. This is very much so a Roman thing. They were also into their bodies. And he says, do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed. And notice that it says be transformed. It's passive. Somebody from the outside is doing this. He's actually saying, stop becoming like everything around you, but be transformed. Let the Holy Spirit change you by changing your mindset so that you may show what this is all about. And that's very typical, that you have an entry and that you have an argument, and that, especially when Paul writes it, that it comes to a very practical point. So now what do we do? What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? You see this also in another letter, Ephesians, the one that you're reading in its entirety. It's not very long. Here's a beautiful picture of some of the archaeological remains. You see a big facade of the library. Some people think, remember, it's disputed that Paul did not write the letters to Ephesians and Colossians, and with good reasons. The wording is different. The setting seems to be from a different time. Others think that Paul may very well have written it. It has a different sort of style. We call it rhetoric. That's a little bit more in line with what you would find over in Turkey and Asia. And so it's very possible that Paul figured that out. Very smart man. It's also possible that some students who were trained under him wrote that. Either way, you kind of see this idea of the overlap with Colossians. Whoever did this in community writing also wrote to Colossians, because it has a lot in common. It's actually likely that this letter was kind of shared among the churches, a circular letter, and that the focus is on the grace that Christ brought, that Jesus brought. And that's really needed because, just like in Romans, two parties had to join. So there too, you have Jewish people and non-Jewish people called Gentiles trying to live this Christian life together. And it's hard. You need a lot of grace for that. In fact, there's a lot of introductory parts there in the letter. And then when you come to chapter 2, some symbolism is used. But at one point it says in verse 14, for he, that's Jesus, is our peace. He is our peace. Interesting, because in the Roman world, the emphasis was on the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. It's not the peace of Rome that helps us to live together. It's Jesus. Jesus is our peace. And in his flesh, through his life, he has made both groups into one. There's enough raw material that we can find commonality. And so that's emphasis there. Book also has a cosmic focus, like broader realities. That makes sense because it's still a part there. That part of the world is a part of the greater Greco-Roman world, where you have to believe in the pantheon and spiritual realities. Notice how it starts in chapter 1, verse 20 and 21. God put his power to work in Christ when he raised him from the dead, seated him at his right hand in the heavenly places, an emphasis on the right hand. The God's on the right hand, more powerful. The right hand is the hand with authority, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, and above every name that is named, not only in this age, but also the age to come. Emphasis on names with power. And then notice when you come to the end of the letter in chapter 6, it says, finally, to the believers, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his power. And then it talks about some spiritual armor. Very interesting. So that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For our struggle is not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. This is definitely something that the people in Ephesus would have believed in. They had temples with spirits, and so tapping into that culture. For Colossians, remember, there's not a whole lot that has been dug up there. There's no big archaeological city, but that definitely remains there. Same kind of problem as we have in Ephesians. Like, who wrote it? If it's Paul, it would have been early because Paul probably dies in the aftermath of the fire of Rome. If it's later, it would have been people that were influenced by his teaching. Some church fathers, so later church leaders, thought that maybe Philemon wrote it because he had connections in Colossians, lived there. And so we don't really know everything, but the theme here really is the power of Jesus, that he conquered all these evil powers and heavenly things. When you read the letter, you see that there's a lot of writing against stuff, against other teachings, aberrant teachings. You see they're warned against particular philosophies and certain Jewish practices. They're being forced upon people. They spoke out against asceticism, this overt emphasis on spirituality over the material world, but it gets out of whack. They're being warned against angelolatry, where people worship angels. And so sometimes by what is being emphasized, you can figure out what the problems were in there, that people were, off kilter. It actually mentions a psalm, we think. In the opening chapter of Colossians, there's this beautiful wording there, but look at it. It's like poetic. He's the image, talking about Jesus, the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him, I mean, when you keep reading that, it's like, whoa, it's very different from the rest of it. And so most people think that this is just like some people do now, some people quote lyrics from a song. And so that's probably what he does here. So just kind of know where you find that. How cool is that? If we go forward, there are what we call the pastoral letters. We kind of group them together, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, 3 letters together. We call them the pastoral letters. They're written by people that have been trained up. We often think that 1st and 2nd Timothy were written to Ephesus. You're right, if you pick up on the name, this is a reference to a young person traveling with Paul, and you see a picture here of a big old theater in Ephesus. So what do we do here? Well, If it's Paul that writes these letters, it got to be right before he dies. But remember, these are disputed letters. First and Second Timothy goes to Ephesus. Titus is actually written to an island, Crete. So if it's Paul, then he writes from Rome. But really, the content of these letters, it just seems to deal with matters that come up later in the church. So a lot of people actually think that this might reflect just the writing of the next generation of Christians. And so that pushes it later. It doesn't mean that there's not any kind of Pauline influence. This could have been people out of his circles, but it certainly pushes it later. So it seems to give advice to missionaries who function as pastors. So in 1st and 2nd Timothy, just like in Colossians, it just stands firm against teachings that do not originate with the apostles. It says, why don't you focus on prayer and worship and don't let other people tell you how to do it, and puts together a leadership structure. Same happens in Titus. He's supposed to appoint leaders on Crete and work with some sort of structure model. So here are some questions, right? If we consider some of these part of the Pauline community, whether or not you think that these were written by Paul, some of them, even the ones that are written way later, they're influenced by people that were in Paul's circles, right? So what are common themes? What do you see emerging here? A lot of them have to do with correcting behavior, right? Or dealing with expectations about behavior. The question is, why do people in Jesus communities have to behave a certain way anyways? Why not just live? I mean, that may seem like a really weird question, but why be so, focused on a certain way of living? And what was the vision for the church, and why does it even matter? In other words, why write these letters? Why confront people? And what's the point of church? And this may sound like an easy question, but think about it. And sometimes when I ask these in my classrooms, my students answer, well, the common themes are sin and forgiveness of sin. But really, is it? Is that really true? Every single letter is the main focus sin? Or is that what we preach about a lot? And why is behavior emphasized? Why do we have church anyways? And sometimes, often, my students emphasize that it helps people to become better people. Now I'm looking in the camera and I'm just giving you an opinion. You don't have to agree with any of the opinions given in any of these videos. There's a disclaimer in the syllabus, right? This is just an opinion. For me personally, I'm a Jesus follower. For me personally, it's not enough to get me up out of bed in the morning thinking that Christianity is all about me becoming a better person. It's just not motivating. It doesn't motivate me. I know I come from a different culture, joined America later. It's not enough for me to invest all time and energy in becoming a better person so that one day when I die, somebody can give a tear-jerker eulogy and talk about what a good person I was. She was so kind. Everybody she met lit up the room. Probably not. But I put in all this effort just so one day people can say nice things. There has to be something bigger than that. And I think that's what this is about. I think these Jesus communities were spreading around the Mediterranean because Jesus said go, because they have a message. And their message goes back to the story, the narrative of the New Testament. There's a story to be shared about restoration. It goes together with a story on healing. It goes together with what the plan of God was from the beginning and how one day it will be restored. And these little communities have to be little microcosms of it. It has to show that we've had a glimpse of what it can be. And so when I get up in the morning, it needs to be something bigger than myself. We need to be able to change people's lives, make things right that are wrong, and give our kids a better chance, and have other people in our society have a better chance. And who cares if I'm a better person for it? I want better communities. I want better families. I want better societies because of what Jesus did. And so when these churches were out there, they received corrective writings because they shouldn't just be there kind of huddling together in a little huddle. The people from the outside looking in were supposed to say, I don't know what's going on, but these people have something. They got something, and I want to know what the something is. And that's the vision for the church. Purpose. And it comes in different forms, doesn't it? Very interesting. Love to hear your take on it.